The Hashish Man, Chapter 9 of A Dreamer's Tales, by Lord Dunsany. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. I was at a dinner in London the other day. The ladies had gone upstairs, and no one sat on my right. On my left there was a man I did not know, but he knew my name somehow apparently, for he turned to me after a while and said, "I read a story of yours about Bethmora in a review." Of course I remembered the tale. It was about a beautiful oriental city that was suddenly deserted in a day. Nobody quite knew why. I said, "Oh yes," and slowly searched in my mind for some more fitting acknowledgment of the compliment that his memory had paid me. I was greatly astonished when he said, "You were wrong about the Nausar sickness. It was not that at all." I said, "Why, have you been there?" And he said, "Yes, I do it with hashish. I know Bethmora well." And he took out of his pocket a small box full of some black stuff that looked like tar but had a stranger smell. He warned me not to touch it with my finger, as the stain remained for days. "I got it from a gypsy," he said. "He had a lot of it, as it had killed his father." But I interrupted him, for I wanted to know for certain what it was that had made desolate that beautiful city, Bethmora, and why they fled from it swiftly in a day. Was it because of the desert's curse, I asked? And he said, "Partly it was the fury of the desert, and partly the advice of the emperor, Thubamlin, for that fearful beast is in some way connected with the desert on his mother's side." And he told me this strange story. You remember the sailor with the black scar who was there on the day that you described when the messengers came on mules to the gate of Bethmora and all the people fled? I met this man in a tavern drinking rum, and he told me all about the flight from Bethmora, but knew no more than you did what the message was or who had sent it. However, he said he would see Bethmora once more whenever he touched again at an eastern port, even if he had to face the devil. He often said that he would face the devil to find out the mystery of that message that had emptied Bethmora in a day. And in the end he had to face Thubamlin, whose weak ferocity he had not imagined. For one day the sailor told me he had found a ship, and I met him no more after that in the tavern drinking rum. It was about that time that I got the hashish from the gypsy, who had a quantity that he did not want. It takes one literally out of oneself. It is like wings. You swoop over distant countries and into other worlds. Once I found out the secret of the universe. I have forgotten what it was, but I know that the Creator does not take creation seriously, for I remember that he sat in space with all his work in front of him and laughed. I have seen incredible things in fearful worlds. As it is your imagination that takes you there, so it is only by your imagination that you can get back. Once, out in the ether, I met a battered, prowling spirit that had belonged to a man whom drugs had killed 100 years ago, and he led me to regions that I had never imagined. And we parted in anger beyond the Pleiades, and I could not imagine my way back. And I met a huge gray shape that was the spirit of some great people, perhaps of a whole star, and I besought it to show me my way home, and it halted beside me like a sudden wind and pointed, and, speaking quite softly, asked me if I discerned a certain tiny light, and I saw a far star faintly, and then it said to me, "That is the solar system," and strode tremendously on. And somehow I imagined my way back, and only just in time, for my body was already stiffening in a chair in my room, and the fire had gone out and everything was cold, and I had to move each finger one by one, and there were pins and needles in them, and dreadful pains in the nails, which began to thaw. And at last I could move one arm, and reached a bell, and for a long time no one came, because everyone was in bed. But at last a man appeared, and they got a doctor, and he said that it was hashish poisoning, but it would have been all right if I hadn't met that battered, prowling spirit. I could tell you astounding things that I have seen, but you want to know who sent that message to Bethmora. Well, it was Thubamlin, and this is how I know. I often went to the city after that day you wrote of, I used to take hashish of an evening in my flat, and I always found it uninhabited. Sand had poured into it from the desert, and the streets were yellow and smooth, and through open swinging doors the sand had drifted. One evening I had put the guard in front of the fire and settled into a chair and eaten my hashish, and the first thing that I saw when I came to Bethmora was a sailor with the black scar, strolling down the street and making footprints in the yellow sand. And now I knew that I should see what secret power it was that kept Bethmora uninhabited. I saw that there was anger in the desert, for there were storm clouds heaving along the skyline, and I heard a muttering amongst the sand. The sailor strolled down the street, looking into the empty houses as he went. Sometimes he shouted, and sometimes he sang, and sometimes he wrote his name on a marble wall. Then he sat down on a step and ate his dinner. After a while he grew tired of the city and came back up the street. As he reached the gate of green copper, 3 men on camels appeared. I could do nothing. I was only a consciousness, invisible, wandering. My body was in Europe. The sailor fought well with his fists, but he was overpowered and bound with ropes and led away through the desert. I followed for as long as I could stay, and found that they were going by way of the desert round the hills of Hap towards Utnarvahi, and then I knew the camel men belonged to Thubamleen. I work in an insurance office all day, and I hope you won't forget me if you ever want to insure life, fire, or motor, but that's no part of my story. I was desperately anxious to get back to my flat, though it is not good to take hashish 2 days running. But I wanted to see what they would do to the poor fellow, for I had heard bad rumors about Thubamleen. When at last I got away, I had a letter to write. Then I rang for my servant and told him I must not be disturbed, though I left my door unlocked in case of accidents. After that I made up a good fire, and sat down and partook of the pot of dreams. I was going to the palace of Thubamleen. I was kept back longer than usual by noises in the street, but suddenly I was up above the town. The European countries rushed by beneath me, and there appeared the thin white palace spires of horrible Thubamleen. I found him presently at the end of a little narrow room. A curtain of red leather hung behind him, on which all the names of God, written in Yanish, were worked with a golden thread. 3 windows were small and high. The emperor seemed no more than about 20, and looked small and weak. No smiles came on his nasty yellow face, though he tittered continually. As I looked from his low forehead to his quivering under lip, I became aware that there was some horror about him, though I was not able to perceive what it was. And then I saw it. The man never blinked, and though later on I watched those eyes for a blink, it never happened once. And then I followed the emperor's rapt glance, and I saw the sailor lying on the floor, alive but hideously rent, and the royal torturers were at work all round him. They had torn long strips from him, but had not detached them, and they were torturing the ends of them far away from the sailor. The man that I met at dinner told me many things which I must omit. The sailor was groaning softly, and every time he groaned, Thubamleen tittered. I had no sense of smell, but I could hear and see, and I do not know which was the most revolting, the terrible condition of the sailor, or the happy, unblinking face of horrible Thubamleen. I wanted to go away, but the time was not yet come, and I had to stay where I was. Suddenly the emperor's face began to twitch violently, and his under lip quivered faster, and he whimpered with anger, and cried with a shrill voice in Yanish to the captain of his torturers that there was a spirit in the room. I feared not, for living men cannot lay hands on a spirit, but all the torturers were appalled at his anger, and stopped their work, for their hands trembled in fear. Then 2 men of the spear guard slipped from the room, and each of them brought back presently a golden bowl with knobs on it, full of hashish, and the bowls were large enough for heads to have floated in had they been filled with blood. And the two men fell to rapidly, each eating with two great spoons. There was enough in each spoonful to have given dreams to 100 men. And there came upon them soon the hashish state, and their spirits hovered, preparing to go free, while I feared horribly, but ever and anon they fell back again to their bodies, recalled by some noise in the room. Still the men ate, but lazily now and without ferocity. At last the great spoons dropped out of their hands, and their spirits rose and left them. I could not flee, and the spirits were more horrible than the men, because they were young men and not yet wholly molded to fit their fearful souls. Still the sailor groaned softly, evoking little titters from the Emperor Thubamlean. Then the two spirits rushed at me and swept me thence as gusts of wind sweep butterflies, and away we went from that small, pale, heinous man. There was no escaping from these spirits' fierce insistence. The energy in my minute lump of the drug was overwhelmed by the huge spoonsful that these men had eaten with both hands. I was whirled over Arvel Woondery and brought to the lands of Snith, and swept on still until I came to Kragua, and beyond this to those bleak lands that are nearly unknown to fancy. And we came at last to those ivory hills that are named the Mountains of Madness, and I tried to struggle against the spirits of that frightful emperor's men, for I heard on the other side of the ivory hills the pittering of those beasts that prey on the mad, as they prowled up and down. It was no fault of mine that my little lump of hashish could not fight with their horrible spoonsful. Someone was tugging at the hall door bell. Presently a servant came and told our host that a policeman in the hall wished to speak to him at once. He apologized to us and went outside, and we heard a man in heavy boots who spoke in a low voice to him. My friend got up and walked over to the window and opened it and looked outside. "I should think it will be a fine night," he said. Then he jumped out. When we put our astonished heads out of the window to look for him, he was already out of sight. End of The Hashish Man. Chapter 9 of A Dreamer's Tales by Lord Dunsany. Recording by David Mack.